Robert Griffin III said something this week that landed differently than the usual wave of quarterback commentary washing over the Cleveland situation. He said the Browns locker room believes it can win with Shedeur Sanders, not Watson, not Gabriel, Shedeur specifically. And I've been turning that over in my mind ever since, because there's a version of that claim you could dismiss as April media cycle noise, another voice adding heat to a story that already has plenty of it. But I don't think that's the right read. I think when you actually understand what locker room conviction means in professional football, and what it takes to produce it, what RG3 described is one of the most significant pieces of information to emerge from Cleveland in months. Let me explain why the locker room dimension of this matters more than it's being given credit for in most of the coverage. There's a category of knowledge that exists inside an NFL building that is simply not accessible from the outside, no matter how good your sources are or how carefully you study the film. It lives in the film room at 6 in the morning before the required sessions begin. It lives in the informal conversations during walkthrough breaks, in the way a quarterback handles himself when a receiver runs the wrong route and the play falls apart. It lives in the huddle during a 2-minute drill when the game is slipping away and someone needs to steady 11 people at once. Coaches can evaluate mechanics and processing speed and arm trajectory. They cannot evaluate what players feel when that quarterback walks into the room. That's the dimension RG3 is describing. And when that dimension has reached something approaching consensus, when the guys who are going to physically fight to protect this quarterback and extend plays for him and dig deep in the fourth quarter have collectively decided who gives them life, that assessment predicts outcomes in ways that advanced metrics can't touch. Think about what this locker room has actually witnessed firsthand. They watched Shedeur arrive in Cleveland and immediately treat every optional moment like a mandatory one. They watched him be the only quarterback in the building during a voluntary workout while his competition was somewhere else entirely. They watched him earn a captain designation from Todd Monken before the formal competition had even officially opened. Not a lifetime achievement award, but an active recognition of something being demonstrated daily in the facility. Some of these players were there through the Watson years. They carry the lived experience of what organizational hope attached to a quarterback who can no longer deliver on it actually looks and feels like from inside the building. That comparison exists in that locker room, whether it appears in any media coverage or not. They know both realities personally. And according to RG3, they've drawn their conclusion. Now let me spend some time on Andrew Berry's recent public comments, because I think the front office dimension of this conversation gets collapsed too quickly into the coaching narrative when they're actually doing distinct and important work. Berry sat down for a pre-draft media session and said Cleveland wouldn't disqualify adding a quarterback in the draft, that they have strong feelings about the quarterbacks currently in the building, and that any addition would be evaluated independently of existing roster construction. Berry is one of the more precise communicators in NFL front office circles. He doesn't reach for dramatic language or telegraph organizational anxiety through his word choices. So the correct reading of that statement isn't panic or uncertainty about Shedeur. The correct reading is a general manager communicating that his organization makes football decisions based on football merit, full stop. If the best available option at a given pick improves this team, they take it. That's professional roster management, not a referendum on anyone currently in the quarterback room. What makes the draft context genuinely interesting is that Cleveland is operating from a position of real capital flexibility this cycle. Multiple analysts have projected scenarios where the Browns maneuver to acquire multiple top 40 picks while still addressing offensive tackle, wide receiver, and cornerback. That's not a team scrambling. That's a team with options, with leverage, making decisions from a platform of choice rather than desperation. And that context matters for how we understand every decision being made right now, including at quarterback. When an organization has genuine flexibility, their choices reveal their actual football convictions rather than their constrained responses to limited alternatives. The Browns choosing to develop Shedeur under these circumstances, with real draft capital available and real options at the position, is a different and more meaningful signal than it would be if he were their only viable path forward. The Todd Monken dimension of this is the one I keep returning to because I think it's being consistently underweighted in the broader conversation. He said publicly, not in a carefully hedged press conference answer, but plainly that quarterback reps in the offseason will not be divided equally. Sit with that for a moment, because coaching staffs in the NFL almost never say something like that before formal competition begins. The standard diplomatic posture is to maintain the language of open competition, to tell every media member that everyone has a real shot, to protect the internal process from external pressure by keeping the public framing deliberately ambiguous. Monken discarded that playbook. He told you that he has already formed a working judgment about where the developmental investment should go, and he is going to structure his program accordingly. That's not optics management. That's a head coach describing his actual operational philosophy out loud, with his name attached to it. Understanding why Shedeur fits Monken's system specifically requires some genuine schematic examination, because I don't want to just assert that he's the right fit. I want to show you the mechanism. Monken operates a fast-tempo, multiple formation offense that makes extraordinary demands on a quarterback's pre-snap processing. The entire design philosophy depends on the quarterback identifying defensive leverage before the snap, making line adjustments based on what the coverage is showing, and distributing the ball across a spread formation before defensive pressure can compromise the play's intended structure. This is not a system you can run successfully if your quarterback's mental processing is operating behind the play's development rather than parallel to it. The play has to be essentially decided before it happens, confirmed by pre-snap reads, executed through timing rather than improvisation. Shedeur's entire college profile, evaluated honestly and stripped of the noise around his draft process, was built on exactly this quality. His completion percentage adjusted for throw difficulty ranked among the highest in the recorded history of college football. Not because he was throwing safe horizontal routes, but because his pre-snap identification and his decision timing were operating at an unusual level for a player his age. That's the specific cognitive skill Monken's system most needs. And here's the piece of the schematic argument that I think gets overlooked. You can install a complex system into a young quarterback with limited professional habits far more efficiently than you can reinstall it into a veteran who has spent years building ingrained reads and responses in a different offensive environment. The blank slate isn't a liability here. Given what Monken is trying to build, it's actually an advantage. I want to treat Watson's situation with the seriousness it deserves rather than just dismissing it, because the human dimension of it is real and the football dimension has genuine complexity. Jimmy Haslam said recently that Watson has a great chance under Monken. New scheme, fresh context, a coaching staff that hasn't been shaped by the failures of the previous years. And if I'm being honest about the football imagination of that scenario, I understand the appeal. The Watson who operated in Houston before everything changed was legitimately special. Creative movement in the pocket, arm talent that could threaten every level of a defense, the ability to extend plays and create in ways that quarterbacks with purely conventional skill sets simply cannot. That player, fully healthy, in Monken's system, would be a viable starting quarterback on most NFL rosters. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but the relevant question has never been what Watson was. The relevant question is what Watson is right now, given everything the timeline from Cleveland's acquisition to this moment has actually produced. 19 games since he arrived, multiple serious injuries, an Achilles setback that eliminated the entire 2025 season before it could develop any meaningful momentum, and the internal medical characterization coming from people with genuine access to the organizational conversations, not outside speculation, but informed reporting about what the building actually understands about his physical condition. That doesn't describe normal injury concern requiring patience. It describes specific, acute concern about his ability to sustain even early season contact without the physical situation deteriorating further. A coaching staff cannot build a competitive structure around a quarterback whose week-to-week availability cannot be projected with confidence. That's not a judgment about Watson's character or competitive desire. It's a practical impossibility. Cleveland fans understand this with a visceral clarity that no analytical framework can fully capture, because they've lived inside this situation in a way that national observers haven't. They've absorbed the waiting, the carefully worded injury updates that said everything through what they didn't say, the seasons that evaporated before any meaningful football could be played, the emotional investment in a situation that kept asking for patience while the returns kept failing to arrive. When RG3 says the locker room has genuine belief in Shedeur and not in Watson, that claim doesn't land in Cleveland as a quarterback competition assessment. It lands as someone finally saying out loud what the fan base has been carrying in their gut for a long time. The relief in that recognition is real. I want to be precise about Gabriel's situation as well, because he tends to be the third name invoked and then dropped from serious analysis, and I think his actual competitive posture matters for understanding the full dynamic of this quarterback room. The reporting circulating around him suggests a player who has read the organizational signals clearly enough to understand that his path to meaningful playing time in Cleveland is unlikely to materialize under current circumstances. If that's accurate, if Gabriel has internally concluded that he's not going to win this competition and is navigating toward whatever comes next, his participation in the formal evaluation has a fundamentally different character than it would if he genuinely believed he had a shot. Practice energy reflects belief. Film room investment reflects genuine competitive stakes. And a quarterback who has already processed the reality of his situation brings a different competitive texture to training camp than one who is genuinely fighting for a job he believes he can win. The trade speculation around him isn't the story. The story is what his presence in the building actually represents for the competition's real structure. Now, let me say something directly about the choice the organization faces, because I think it's the most important framing for everything else happening in Cleveland right now. Full commitment to Shedeur's development, structuring the entire offseason and training camp around him, giving him the rep distribution and system installation his talent requires, orienting the organizational infrastructure toward answering the question of what his ceiling actually is, produces a specific developmental environment. It gives a genuinely talented young quarterback the conditions under which players at his level either prove they're real or prove they aren't. Continued hedging toward Watson as a way of managing the organizational weight of the contract produces a different environment. Fragmented preparation, delayed installation, another season where clarity is sacrificed to the psychology of sunk cost. Those are not equivalent outcomes dressed in different language. They are genuinely different futures for the franchise. Monken appears to understand this distinction in his bones. His rep distribution comments, his captain designation of Shedeur, his willingness to say publicly what most coaches keep private, all of it reflects a head coach who has made his football judgment and has structured his program around it rather than around the diplomatic management of competing interests. The locker room, according to RG3, has made its own parallel judgment independently. The scouts' film evaluation, the coaching staff's daily observation, the teammates' lived experience, the front office's roster flexibility, all of it is converging toward the same place. What gives me real conviction when I look at this situation honestly is that this convergence doesn't feel manufactured or organizationally constructed. It feels like the authentic result of multiple independent evaluations, all processing the same evidence and arriving at the same conclusion. The player who keeps showing up, who treats optional like mandatory, who earns a captain designation through daily behavior rather than draft status, who won divisional games at the end of last season under conditions specifically calibrated to expose whatever weaknesses existed and found ways to win them anyway. All of those evaluations, the coaching staffs, the players, the front offices, are pointing at the same young quarterback who has spent every available moment since arriving in Cleveland proving that the fifth-round label attached to his name describes where he was picked, not who he actually is. Cleveland has been searching for this kind of convergent organizational belief around a quarterback for a very long time. It appears to finally be here.